Hi, my name is Hub Vandervoort. I'm the CTO of Enterprise Infrastructure for Progress Software. Perhaps you've heard of us in our new Responsive Process Management Suite. People ask me all the time, Hub, give me the elevator pitch on RPM. I haven't found an elevator ride long enough to tell it, but if you'll join me here for the next 20 minutes at the whiteboard, I'd love to tell you the story. So how does it begin? Well, it begins simply with a line. It's a line that each of us live around every day. It's the line that separates business from IT. And what I find fascinating when I speak to business and IT folks, they each have their own vocabulary for describing what it is they do. Business people tend to talk about what they do most often in terms of process. IT folks, on the other hand, tend to talk about things in terms of services and IT service. But both of them talk about what they do in terms of management, business process management and IT service management. But what I also find is that management these days just isn't enough. All of them talk about what they do in terms of optimization. They all want to optimize what they do. And when business people talk about optimizing, they tend to talk about it in a variety of terms. They talk about it in terms of cost and profit, reducing the cost associated with their business, making sure that everything is done with maximum profit potential. They also talk about it in terms of revenue enhancement. The idea that they cross-sell and upsell every customer, whether they're on the website or in the store, making sure that customer leaves with his arms full, that customer satisfaction is at its highest. They also talk about it in terms of GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, making sure that we're preventing loss, making sure that that fraudulent transaction never occurs, making sure that everybody's in compliance. Those are the drivers that drive business today. Those are the goals that everyone in business is trying to achieve. But what I assert when I think about all of these things together, they're talking about one thing: velocity. Here's a way to think about velocity. When I was a kid, every Saturday morning commercial used to say, allow 6 to 8 weeks for delivery. Can you imagine a single business that could work at that speed today? Not a chance. In fact, I would say that through the 90s, the standard of excellence became next-day service. Through the 2000s, same-day service became the expectation. Today, velocity means same-session service. Think about it. I can go to my wireless carrier site, change my calling plan, my rating, the number of minutes I have, and by the time I hit submit, my phone beeps and my new calling plan's in place. I can change my health insurance plan and go right to the hospital and make a claim against it. I can even buy a car online and go right down to the dealer and pick it up. That's same session service, and that's the new gold standard of excellence for velocity. And every business needs that today. Now, when we talk about velocity in the IT domain, people tend to talk about it in terms of agility. I have to have the agility to support not only transactional velocity, the idea that I catch the criminal, that I enhance the sale, make sure he's got everything in his arms before he leaves the store, or making sure that that train car never leaves the station half empty. All of those things have to happen in the context of a transaction and in the moment. But equally, I have to support change velocity. As the business realizes new and smarter ways of doing what it does, it needs to change its processes and its IT infrastructure that supports it. When we talk about agility in those terms at Progress, we talk about it in terms of the 7 points of mediation. Now, we've talked about this as a central design tenet of service-oriented architecture and the way that you actually achieve agility in SOA for years. And I won't talk about all of the details here today, but I will list them because it's important to understand what they are. Protocol, location, interaction model, format and semantics, quality of service and quality of privacy or protection, sequencing, and error recovery. Those are the 7 points of mediation. There's a simple way of testing whether I've achieved the 7 points of mediation. Consider the statement, I can make asymmetric change. Now, oftentimes when I say that, people ask me, do I mean asymmetric change? Not at all. We do that in enterprise infrastructure all the time. It's when we all come together Saturday night at midnight to make a symmetric change, hoping that it'll work so we don't have to fall back to the old release. Not at all. An asymmetric change is one that I make all by myself. Think of this example. If I was an AT&T customer, I'm automatically using the GSM protocol. But if I was to switch to Verizon Wireless, I would have to switch to the CDMA protocol. Now, I don't have to notify all my friends. They don't have to update their contact manager. We don't have Jindy and LDAP server updates or routing table changes. No, not at all. I make the switch by myself, and I continue to call them, and they blissfully continue to call me. That's an asymmetric change. And ultimately, if I can make asymmetric change, I've achieved the maximum in agility and can get that velocity that gets me the optimization I'm after. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the 7 points of mediation. Now, how does this get delivered? At Progress, we talk about services first in terms of a bus. In fact, when most people start out in their service-oriented architecture design, they start with an ESB. And ESBs are outstanding at doing protocol, location, and interaction model mediation. But what about the rest of the 7 points of mediation? In order to achieve format mediation in the same manner, I need semantic control. And for that, we end up using our Data Extend Semantic Integrator product. Now, at the bus level, Sonic is the gold standard for enterprise service buses. In fact, it was the first of its kind. But together, we start to complete the 7 points of mediation. What about quality of service and quality of privacy? Well, these issues are about policy. And policy mediation with Progress is achieved through Actional, one of the leading service management platforms for runtime policy governance. But what about sequencing and error recovery? This is where the story gets very interesting, because when we talk about sequencing and error recovery in the IT space, we talk about it in terms of service orchestration languages, things like BPL and itineraries. But when we talk about sequencing and error recovery at the business process level, we're talking about it in terms of business process management, BPM. And BPM and service orchestration together give us the capability to meet sequencing and error recovery requirements in both IT and business terms. That's where we begin the story of RPM. So let's look at it. When we talk about business process management, we start with a business process model. Today, BPM models are the gold standard for defining business processes because they're accessible to the business. They're visible, and they create a way that business people can see exactly what's going on. And what's even more compelling about business process management is the methodology and the life cycle that it works in. BPM ultimately involves a four-step life cycle. You model, you automate, you measure, and then you optimize. The idea simply is that I create a model that looks like this, a canvas that business process can be defined by business people. And unlike the old days where we use this as a specification for people to write programs to, we can automate this model directly. Engines actually will execute these business processes as they're defined. And more fascinating and powerful still is that those models, as they're executing, create measurements that are defined exactly in the context of those models. We can see KPIs, metrics, hotspots, which are fed into optimization tools that allow us to see exactly how queuing is working, how wait states are working, how load and work allocation is occurring, so that we can optimize these processes in ways that inform how we remodel and ultimately re-automate for improvement through the business process. And what's been proven time again is that each time someone turns this crank, They can customarily expect 5 to 20% business process improvement on each turn. Now, eventually you'll hit diminishing returns, but that kind of result is realized all the time. Now, while that all sounds very powerful, there's one problem with BPM. And that is that many customers we speak to say, you know, Hub, I already have legacy estates that run my processes. And my processes are very complex and they're supported by tons of pre-existing technology. As interesting as this sounds and as compelling as that sounds, I simply can't afford the time, the risk, or the effort involved with replacing all of this. I don't know if it's even going to work until I've done the replacement. Can I take that chance? Now, when we looked at this at Progress Software, we asked the question, what if I could short circuit directly from model to measure and avoid that automate step? Well, at Progress, we decided to take the same visibility capability that we use to support our policy enforcement to now introduce business transaction assurance. And business transaction assurance allows us to, in effect, reverse engineer what we're seeing on the legacy pipeline into a business process model so that the business can now understand much more clearly what it's doing and why, even without having to automate the system around BPM. So what do we call it when we reverse engineer a process this way? We call it a shadow process. And this is utterly unique to Progress. In fact, we've even applied for patent on the concept. It allows us to reverse engineer what we're seeing on the legacy environment and begin bringing about the benefits of this virtuous cycle and 5 to 20% optimizations without having to fully automate as a first step. Now, how does that work in the real world? We call these optimizations aux processes or auxiliary processes, and they come in 4 types: notification, escalation, remediation, and customer communication. So a prime example of that is a story that British Airways told us. They said that their existing legacy systems occasionally loses bags. But what happens? They leave their customers standing at the carousel for 20 minutes, only to wait for another 20 minutes in the baggage office to figure out how to get it back. Now, what if they could somehow put an auxiliary process in place that notified somebody that the bag was lost, escalated it if it wasn't handled in time, showed the guy how to recover the bag, and most importantly, communicated to that customer with an SMS before he went wheels down that his bag was in fact lost, but he didn't have to wait at the carousel. He could go on, simply SMS where he wanted the bag to catch up with him. Somehow the customer leaves the airport without his bag, but a whole lot happier than he would have left before. And that's a great example of how auxiliary process improves the process without actually having to do full-scale automation implementation. And so therefore, one of the key and first value props of RPM is that RPM optimizes faster with shadow processes. That's something that BPM simply can't do, and the first of our many advantages around RPM. But here's something interesting. I've never seen a single business that runs on a single process. Here's an example. Go to Amazon.com and ask a programmer there, what's the scope of a transaction at Amazon? He's probably apt to say it's from the time somebody hits www.amazon until they click submit on a book order form. And from his perspective, that's a perfectly valid example of a transaction. Until you turn around and ask the Amazon customer what his view of a transaction with Amazon is. There, he's probably apt to say it's from the time I imagined owning a book until it showed up in my mailbox. Well, if all I did was look at the web process, I clearly wouldn't see the entirety of that customer experience. In order to see the customer's experience, I have to include the supply chain, the books coming from Addison Wesley, O'Reilly, and McGraw-Hill, as well as the delivery chain, the packages going out through UPS, DHL, and FedEx. And what's even more interesting is that all 3 of those processes are designed by 3 different people at Amazon who probably never speak to each other. More fascinating still is all three of those processes run at the same time. In fact, they're multiplexed together, running all simultaneously. Now, here's what's interesting. When I see a subject matter expert in one of those three areas actually pursue that virtuous cycle and optimize his process, all too often his optimization comes at the expense of de-optimizing one of the other guy's processes. And more fascinating still is that because they're multiplexed, when one box shows up late from O'Reilly, I'm left with the question, do I ship twice? Or do I send the first package and put a coupon in place to keep the customer happy? Or do I hold the package and blow my customer SLA? Do I source the books from a third-party supplier and ultimately do so at a higher cost? Well, each of those options, if I only had to do it once a day, would be simple. But if I have to do it 10,000 times a day at the highest customer sat or the lowest possible cost, my head's going to explode. So how do I deal with that? Ultimately, looking at the problem in 2D just doesn't cut it. But if I drill a Z-axis through that picture and start looking at those processes in 3D, I can make reactions that actually do the right thing each time. It's looking across all three processes simultaneously and making the decision in the moment to optimize the process the correct way for the correct process outcome, customer sat, lowest cost. That's the benefit of RPM. It's able to see in 3D where BPM can only see in 2D. Well, how do we do this at Progress? Ultimately, that completes this triangle. We call this correlating element the piece that can see across processes, business event processing. And that is the linchpin that makes the difference between RPM and BPM. Now, what technology we bring to bear? Ultimately, BPM is provided by our world-class Savion technology. Gold standard BPM capability. As I said earlier, the business transaction assurance is provided by the same visibility that Actional provides for policy enforcement, now to provide end-to-end business transaction visibility and the ability to reverse engineer a process to create shadow processes. And the correlative aspects required for business event processing are provided by Apama. And together, that makes up responsive process management. That sits on top of our enterprise infrastructure capability, which we call responsive business integration. And together, those make up the Progress Suite. So what's the last part of this story? Well, look at this picture. It's not a stack. It's an unstack. Our competitors would draw a stack and try to lock you in with it. With our products, each of our products works independently and on our competitors' technology. Now certainly they're great alone and even better together, and we'd be happy to sell it to you as a complete stack. But if you have existing technology from any of our competition, each of these capabilities can be brought onto those environments to add value, just like I've described to you here today. So the next time you decide to do a process optimization project, make sure you look at Progress's RBI and RPM. Thanks for joining me.